Be talking about, as it says up there, is offshoring application development. Is it a financial dream, or is it a security nightmare, or is it both? My cultural background, I originally come from India. So, you know, a huge offshore destination, of course. I understand the culture and the mindset there. Every third guy I know is either a database administrator or a software developer. And I talk to them a lot. They went to college with me, and I understand what their thoughts are on security. So I'm going to relay some of those to you. And at the same time, of course, my experience here in the US over the last 9 years in the security industry has been helping a lot of companies out with application security initiatives and so on, and the challenges they deal with. So I'm going to combine both those to give you some perspective on what to do and what not to when you're offshoring application development. So for starters, the business drivers of offshoring. That picture is pretty telling in itself, right? But there's some definite business drivers, and that's the reason there's a lot of offshoring these days. The effective cost structure, of course. I mean, you know, you can get things done a lot cheaper, be it in India or Vietnam or Eastern Europe, what have you. So there's a compelling case for a CIO or a head of application development to say, let's send it out there. Obviously, there's a strong knowledge base too. Like I said, you know, a while ago I put out a job request for my company looking for developers, and it was hard to find. It was hard to get qualified resumes. You put it out in India or a place like that, you'll be overwhelmed because, like I said, if you're not a database admin or you're not a developer, you failed in life. And that's the attitude out there. So there's a lot of there's a strong knowledge base to be tapped into, of course. And then there's the whole with, you know, the 24/7 work model. You have things happening here. When it's night here, people working there. So combination of those things. Of course, I'm not here to talk about the businesses of offshoring, but just kind of putting across the point that offshoring is definitely here to stay unless there's some pretty stiff regulatory controls that prevent it. Just a little more perspective on why this topic is of any importance. I grabbed some statistics from the internet. 84% of 500 companies that were interviewed by Information Week said that they actually offshored application development. And you know, outsourcing of enterprise applications is also growing, and B2B and B2C applications are top candidates. So what does that tell us? Outsourcing, and a subset of which is offshoring, are on the up, and primarily application development is what's being sent out there. So being a security person, that raises some concerns in my mind. Just for starters, whose job is security? Now, how many of you in this room have heard of that everybody, somebody, nobody joke? That's kind of what I look at security when you offshore development as. Everyone's just pointing the finger at the other person. It says everybody is supposed to do it, somebody did it, nobody did it, what have you. And I've been involved in a lot of situations with a lot of my clients where, and I'll show you some examples, walk in there, look at an application from a security perspective, be it a source code review or an application pen test, and security is just atrocious, for lack of a better word. It's just horrible. And then when I asked them, I was like, you know, were your developers on drugs when they were developing this? They said, well, they weren't our developers. And what am I going to do? It was developed in a different country. Well, there is a lot you can do, even because it still is your application. The liability is still yours. So kind of solving this problem of security, whose job is it, and what parts of it should be played by whom is what I'm here to talk about. As a result of that whole finger-pointing, blaming game, what I've seen is a few different impacts. The first of which, you know, this graphic here, I'll explain it to you, is pretty telling. We did penetration tests for this bank, a lot of them, New York-based bank actually, and every quarter we would show them what their overall security posture in terms of web applications look like. So we would kind of classify the vulnerabilities at a very high level for senior management and tell them, well, these are some trends we're noticing. Now, if you look at this graphic here, you notice that 5 out of 5 applications here had input validation issues. I know that's a pretty sweeping statement, input validation. A lot of issues fall under that umbrella, but these were critical input validation flaws in banking applications across the board. And as you can see, 4 out of the 5 had authorization issues. We said, well, maybe there's something to be learned from the developers who developed the one which didn't have the authorization issues, right? Well, it just so turned out that that application really didn't have any multiple user levels, so there was no question of authorization. And that's the only reason we didn't see an authorization issue there. But as you can see, when we took this to their senior management, said there looks to be a systemic problem here. You're seeing a recurring trend. You know, rather than tactically trying to solve individual security bugs in applications, this needs to be looked at a strategic level. Well, the response was, the apps are developed offshore. We have no control. And they were ready to shrug off the risk by saying, well, we'll have to figure it out here, but really we can't systematically look at it and say, you know, early in the life cycle it should be taken care of, because that life cycle is not under our control. So recurring vulnerabilities, this graph, probably obviously everyone in this room seen it 100 times. I just put it up here, but in general, what I've noticed is when we look at applications after the fact, which have been developed offshore and there's been poor liaising on the security front, it's always trying to solve the issues at this final stage, which the only people having fun at that point are lawyers. And then obviously regulatory issues. You know, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this alphabet soup that I put up here, and every information security person loves to play the FUD tactics of throwing these names out, so everyone's all scared and say, well, security is important because of the regulatory implications. But you know, if you look at it real carefully, of course, with PCI, like everyone knows here, as of this year, there's certain specific application security requirements in there, and I'm not going to go down the path of bashing PCI and Visa because that'll take away the whole 45 minutes then. So I'll refrain from that, and I hope there's no one from Visa out here right now while I said that. But in essence, you know, the point I'm trying to get across here is that the liabilities due to these regulations and controls are still yours. The regulatory bodies don't care a damn if you develop the application offshore, in-house, or somewhere else. They're still your liability. So I'm going to skip this one. The GLBA one, actually, I just pulled out the excerpt from them, and they seem to be kind of more on the mark as far as addressing this problem specifically and correctly in my mind. You know, they really talk about vendor management programs to establish security requirements, acceptance criterion, and test plans, which is exactly what we as security people tell companies to do when they're outsourcing or offshoring development. And we'll get into that discussion here shortly. But this is one regulation in this regard, at least, kind of hit the mark. And I'm not a big fan of regulations normally, but this one does hit the mark. But that being said, moving out of the boring realm of regulations and such, what I do want to discuss here is a report from the trenches. In addition to doing application security consulting work, I also help organizations respond to security breaches, incident response, and computer forensics. And I have a case here which is of special interest that I'd like to discuss with you the details of, because it kind of ties into this whole realm of offshoring and its security implications. So the symptoms, I guess, in this case were that a retail organization's CEO received a threat, an extortion threat saying, we need $250,000 or we're going to put out 125,000 of your customer credit card numbers out there on the internet. Well, the way this threat showed up was via snail mail or postal mail. It had a little snapshot of a database table from their backend database showing real rows from their database in there to prove that they did have unauthorized access to the backend databases. The interesting thing was the way they demanded the response is they didn't want to establish any contact with these folks. They said, go to the home page on your main website. This was a retailer, online retailer, and right at the bottom, in font 2, put in a yes or a no. And all we'll do is we'll access that home page, and by looking at the yes or no, we know whether you accept our demands, and then we'll figure out a way for you to get the money across to us, or if we need to act otherwise. So it was a pretty slick operation going on here from these extorters. Before I move on to the next slide, let me pose the question out there. How many of you think the CEO said, let's just give in to their demands? Wow, okay. And the rest think that he didn't say that? All right, so it looks like most people in this room still believe in Boy Scouts. Unfortunately, that's not the case. Actually, the CEO in this case just wanted to give in. $250,000 for this giant retailer was pocket change, and said, let's just get done with this and avoid any reputational impact or embarrassment. Fortunately, General Counsel had his head on his shoulders, and he actually ordered an investigation. Through that font 2 on the home page where they had to say yes or no, they began some sort of a negotiation with these extorters, and they went back and forth negotiating for 72 hours to decide. Well, they bought the 72 hours, they brought my team in, we went in there to respond to this, and it was 3 of us for 3 days, and that's a picture of us, no sleep, no air, no food, no water, just locked up in a room, looking at computer systems, trying to figure out, one, what happened, and more importantly, who it was that was extorting them, and if there was a way to stop them. Yeah. I'm sorry? Yeah, so when the initial negotiation started, then it was pretty evident that they were outside the US borders, because then they gradually started getting a little bolder. The question was, how did we get responses back from them? They started getting a little bolder, and they actually started using electronic communications, and it was very evident they were not in the US, but they were bold enough at that point because they knew that law enforcement cooperation was probably far-fetched. So that being said, like I said, it was 3 days on the trot trying to figure out what happened and who these people were. Well, we started off the analysis, following a fairly standard forensic procedure, but rather accelerated because we had only 72 hours to respond. So we kicked it off, said, okay, let's look through the web server logs, let's look through a bunch of places. The goal here being that if they got to the back-end database, there was potentially the highest vulnerability potential in my mind was SQL injection. And so we started trying to look for hints of SQL injection, looking through web server logs and such. Of course, post parameters, as you know, aren't captured in web server logs, so oftentimes, even if there's been a SQL injection attack, you really won't see it just through web server logs. And so that's when we resorted to looking at database server logs. Now, how many of you here have ever looked at database server logs or configured databases to log? Fun activity, right? Because there's not much in there. It's like an all or nothing paradigm. You either go on a Microsoft server, for example, you either go with the C2 level auditing where if your log files fill up, then your database crashes, or you go with the paradigm of logging next to nothing, which is exactly what was happening here. So all we saw was a couple of logins and logouts from the application server's account into the database. Didn't really help our cause. Also, another suspect here was it an insider job? Did an employee from the inside actually get in to the database and shovel the information out? Well, we looked at employee email inboxes, things of that sort, anything we could do in a condensed time frame. As you can see here, we didn't really have any luck. We even ran a couple of popular web application scanners who have their boots out there to look for SQL injection, not much luck. And then finally, the last resort was we said, okay, we're going to have to start looking at the application code and try to figure out if there's any specific vulnerabilities that might have been exploited. But again, at this point, we were probably down another 13, 14 hours having spent time with all these other things. So it's kind of a time bomb ticking away there. The source code, after eliminating all the comments and the blank lines and all the fun stuff, really there was about over 100,000 lines of meaningful source code to go through. I'm sure a lot of you in this room have performed source code analysis. It's not a very fun job if you have that much in such a condensed time frame looking for something you don't even know what you're looking for. So kind of a comprehensive code review, of course, was ruled out, and what we said is we're going to just resort through some hopefully smart scripted searches through there, looking for some very specific things and keep our fingers crossed. So the first thing we did is we said, well, let's just look for every occurrence of the word select through the code archive. So we ran a search. Obviously, as you can see right here, the research resulted in an overwhelming number of hits. There was a lot of raw SQL being used by these developers, and it really didn't help our cause, a whole bunch of select queries. So we said, all right, well, we'll just take it step at a time, and we'll try to narrow it down. Maybe we'll give select star a shot and see if that turns up anything interesting. So we ran a quick regular expression search, select star from, and what we found was there were just 5 hits in code. And one of the hits was rather interesting. It actually was select star from, and I've changed the name, but pseudonym for it is card table, where the customer credit card information was stored. Now, just looking at that, why would a developer ever need to access every entry in the customer credit card database? Just didn't seem right. So that's where we started honing in and figured, well, let's just look at a few lines of code above and below that and try to see what's going on. So here's just a little bit of the code that was in there. I've modified it just slightly, so to protect some confidentiality here. But for those of you who are developers in this room, can you tell me what's going on here? And I've made it pretty explicit, actually. Anyone want a backdoor? What kind of backdoor do we have here? In my mind, it's a very simple, but I thought a very slick backdoor, because if you ran it through just a regular source code scanner or a vulnerability scanner for web applications, it's not something that would pop up right away. What was going on here was this piece of code was looking for this 5th parameter in the URL. Whenever the 5th parameter existed in the URL, and actually the value in this case is when it was equal to let me in, that's not what the value was in the real code. It was this fuzzed string of characters. But just to put the point across, I call it let me in here. When this 5th parameter's value was equal to let me in, that's when you go in and perform a select star against the card table and basically take that data and shovel it back to the person requesting it. I thought that was, like I said, a very simple but a neat way of doing it, because that's not things that people are looking for normally in a source code review. It's looking for other syntactical errors and lack of input validation and things of that nature. So it was pretty evident from that there was a backdoor. It was someone who had access to the code who was able to inject this code in there. And who could it have been? So we started, we knew it was a backdoor. We started looking at the code archives to detect when was this piece of code actually put in there. So we started looking at all the different versions and try to figure out who checked this piece of code in. What we found was that the piece of code was checked in by one of the developers who was contracted, an offshore developer, that they had contracted from a third party in Asia. It was his username associated with the code check-in. And then what was even more interesting is we said, well, now that we know to look for this 5th parameter in the URL called let me in, we can go back to the web server log files and start searching through them and see if it occurs in there. So we did that. We went back in there, and of course we found that parameter in there. Well, guess what? The source IP address, it wasn't even masked. They didn't even jump through different hops. The source IP came from the same country from where this developer was from, and some geolocation pointed us in pretty much an accurate geographic location of the third-party development shop in Asia. So the pieces of the puzzle were kind of coming together, where it was fairly evident that this developer in this offshore development shop injected the backdoor. And in a lot of these low-cost centers, $250,000 is a lot of money, and people can have a very good life with that. So I probably thought it's worth my while just to put this little backdoor in and get settled for life. So we actually notified the development company right away. Most cases were not very, when we perform incident response and we cross international boundaries, we're not very optimistic about the outcome. But in this case, actually, law enforcement was very cooperative at the other end, and it was almost like in a Hollywood flick action kind of thing where they got a hold of the person, and we were able to thwart this attack in under those 72 hours. So it was definitely very movie-like. So any questions on this case study before I move on? All right, yeah. Sure, exactly, and that's what I'm going to get to is, you know, this is not just bashing on an offshore developer. This could have been done by a developer in-house. So the next few slides here, I'm going to discuss, you know, what the differences were and some of the things to look out for. Any other questions on this particular case study? Yeah. Right. I guess he's pretty forgiving here, where he says, you know, it could have been a test function that was embedded in source code and someone forgot about it. Sure, there's no doubt about that. It could have been that. And there was a bunch of other select stars in there which were of that nature, actually, because, you know, it's like, why are they writing these select stars and pulling out the entire database table? But obviously, in this case, it was very evident what was going on, given especially that the web server logs had that exact entry in there, and then the extortion followed soon thereafter. So it was pretty evident that it wasn't something unintentional that was left in there. It was a very intentional backdoor that had been created. All right, we'll get to that in a second. So in terms of legalities, is that evidence sufficient enough? And, you know, when I started off the talk, I said, if you don't have your proactive measures put in place correctly in terms of legalities, SLAs, and other things which we'll discuss here shortly, the only person who have a good time and make a lot of money is lawyers. And that's exactly what was going on here. You had a question? All right, so, right, well, okay, well, let's hold on to that question for 1 second. So the question is, should you not have in your contract with the offshore or outsourced shop that they should actually perform some sort of security testing, and would such a scan have actually caught that? That's exactly what I was kind of getting to. So there's a security divide that I've seen between companies in the US or in the developed nations that outsource and offshore, and those across the Atlantic and the Pacific, depending on which way you look at it. A lot of it is to do with SLAs and legalities, and I'm not a lawyer, but I'll have a brief discussion about that. Obviously, about security being built into the SDLC, there are some very distinct challenges that I'll pose out here, and if I can get some, you know, we'll probably get a debate going on that. And then talking about security acceptance criteria, well, like when you do get code back, how do you make sure that there's appropriate criteria in place which have been already presented to the development shop, saying this is what we're going to test your code against. It's not just all about performance. When it does come to SLAs and legalities, there's a lot of pitfalls that we see from this end, which is often security vulnerabilities aren't even defined. So, you know, to the point that he brought up here, someone can just say, how do you differentiate between a software bug and a security vulnerability? If you think about it from a legal standpoint, it can become a pretty gray area to do that. And if you started saying every software bug was a security vulnerability and you're liable for it, Microsoft wouldn't exist. So, you know, there's a balance there when you're actually outsourcing development to be able to define, and I know Owasp actually has some pretty good guidelines on outsourcing and how to set those agreements in place. Documenting your requirements, just, you know, whether going back to, you know, how is this different from if you did it in-house or not. Most of the times I've seen, at least large financial institutions and such in the US, they have pretty stringent processes for their software development in-house, libraries that are used for specific purposes, and there's a process in place. When things get offshored or outsourced, there's oftentimes that there's holes created in those processes because there's a feeling like, well, the software development is now the job of that company. And because of that, there's a lot of security requirements are not really introduced in the requirements document. It's like, this is what we need from a functionality standpoint, and get it to us yesterday. Well, security doesn't make that cut. Those developers don't care about the security of your organization. They're just going to develop what they're paid for. So it's not always right to point the finger at them. There's a lot of blame to be borne by the companies that offshore and outsource as well. One of the critical things is that defining acceptance criteria, like I said. Well, you can define acceptance criteria for functionality and performance and say if the code that you provide us at the end of the day is not functional or doesn't perform to these metrics, we're not going to accept it and you're going to have to fix that. Well, how come that doesn't happen with security? And oftentimes it doesn't. So, if that's the case, from a legal standpoint, that offshore shop is not really liable because it wasn't a part of the requirements, wasn't a part of the acceptance criteria. They're not liable to give you secure code because you didn't ask for it. And finally, one of the things that I've noticed also goes wrong often, and I've seen this with a lot of firms in the US, and I always tell them that, watch that jurisdiction in the contract verbiage. In the contract language, you'll often find people, if the outsourced firm sends you the contract, they're talking about dispute resolution in their country of residence. I mean, are your lawyers going to be flying out to a developing nation and trying to fight a case on code not being secure? Forget about it. It's probably going to be 25 years before it comes up for hearing. So the jurisdiction is another major issue to watch out for, and I often see that slipping, and again, it's just lawyers partying from there. But another big question is who foots the bill for this? It's all nice to talk about it and say there needs to be security, so on and so forth. Who foots the bill for security? So any ideas? I'd like to kind of throw it out as more of an open question. Whose responsibility really is it to pay for secure code? Is it the So when you say the user, the person actually outsourcing the development, the client in the relationship? Okay, so one of the perspectives is, it's ultimately going to be my code. It's how much risk tolerance I have finally, what regulatory controls I have to be in conformance with. So obviously, it's how much I care about security and how much I'm willing to pay for security. But unfortunately, what I've noticed in a lot of cases, and there's a little anecdote that I have here, like I said, I have a lot of friends out in India who are application developers, and I actually spoke to one of them, it was about 4 years ago, and he worked for a very reputed big firm in India, and I said to him, how come when you're developing applications for financial institutions, especially in developed nations, and I look at you guys' contract, there's not even a mention of the word security in that contract. Why don't you try to sell it as a competitive advantage or something? And he just burst out laughing, and the next 2 minutes all I saw him was rolling on the floor, because he said to me, he's like, and then I said, okay, I get it. How about an optional line item in your statement of work? And he said, buddy, even for an optional line item, I have to go get senior vice president approval in my company. And guess what that means? It's not happening. The market's so competitive that when someone's outsourcing, especially offshoring, all they're looking for is that cost advantage. And a few dollars here or there, they just go with the cheapest provider at that point amongst the reputed ones. And so it doesn't even show up as, we could develop secure code for you. Yeah, it's going to cost you a little more, because guess what? We need some processes and people at our end to actually provide you that secure code. So I agree with him where, I think a large part of that who foots the bill is really the client, because you're going to foot a bigger bill otherwise once it's all done, and you have to kind of retrace through the process when pen testers come in and find vulnerabilities. I think there's a lot of footing the bill from the client, but at the same time, I think the offshore shops also need to realize that if someone is paying for security, then you need to provide them up to the mark service on that front, provide them appropriately qualified developers developing their code, have your own processes scanning and so on at your end. And then, of course, I've noticed with a lot of the contracts and things of that sort that, building security into the SDLC really isn't you know, that no one looks at, even if they put in acceptance criteria, you're still going to have significant delays if there's no checks and balances during the process. It's like, here are the requirements, and here's the code. And well, yeah, we have acceptance criteria, but guess what? The code showed up and violated a few of those, so go fix it. They'll fix it, but you get a lot more delays. So I think there's a huge gap where firms don't realize that even though they're offshoring development, they need to be very involved, much more than they think, at least, in the development process, and have a lot of checkpoints in place, not just when the code's all done, but also, hey, you got your design done, can we look at it? You know, there need to be a lot of checks and balances in place, which, again, is very often lacking. So finally, in terms of security acceptance, you know, again, this is a big question when people say, we offshore to save on cost here, for cost savings, and now you're telling us that every application that comes back needs to go through code reviews to identify things of the nature I discussed, you know, backdoors and things of that sort. It defeats the purpose economically. So, you know, that's an interesting challenge where obviously you have to kind of assign a risk rating to your applications and say, you know, these ones are high business impact and these will go through a full source code review, looking for backdoors in addition to everything else that we look for during our source code review, etc. But, you know, obviously for the slightly more risk tolerant internal applications and so on that come back, you know, there has to be a bit of a compromise there, and you really can't say every line of code will be reviewed by a human being looking for backdoors and everything. It just defeats the purpose. So kind of a balance between some automated process and some manual involvement, just like we do with every other application, but make sure that that's performed prior to signing off and accepting that you've accepted the code. Once you do that, you're really setting yourself up for a lot of legal pains if you want to go back and say, no, it really didn't match those security criteria. So in conclusion, you know, just a few points that I'd like for everyone to think about is, obviously, like we discussed, be willing to pay for security if you want security. Build security requirements into your SLAs or service level agreements. Validate security before acceptance, and then, you know, just for all the development shops out there, I still keep telling my friends, I'm not disillusioned. Every time I visit India, I go back and say, you know, why can't you guys view security as a competitive advantage and actually tell your clients that we're going to develop secure code, and that's how we differentiate ourselves from the other one, rather than just being cheaper than them. I do that, but, you know, whenever I do that and I talk about it, I think, you know, I'm just getting a little carried away, because unfortunately they don't care and they just laugh at me. So that's all I have. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to answer them this time. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Right. Sure.
These guys are developing a very small component, and they're relying on all these other pieces of infrastructure.
Right.
So you really can't pin it down on one group. I mean, it has to be at the enterprise level. You cannot have security enforced to the development shop. You can have good security coding practices that you can train them on, but that's about it. Because there's so many other dependencies, especially legacy applications support.
Sure. So, you know, I guess to answer your second question first, I think you're never going to get perfect security, and you don't get it in in-house applications when you have all the control on your processes and libraries and everything else that's being used. So that obviously is like, you know, expecting nirvana or something. But I think from the perspective of, at least you can expect a basic minimum level of security that you can set. Also, I was talking to some other folks who are actually sitting in this room right now who are in a role where they deal with offshore companies. And you know, one of them told me that they actually push out, for example, the ESAPI that Jeff and Aspect, everyone have put together, Owasp, and kind of tell their developers, use this. At least at that point, you take care of the low-hanging fruit. You know, you're not just showing up with some blatant, stupid cross-site scripting showing up in your web application. So I completely agree with you that you can't get unrealistic and impractical about expecting perfectly secure applications. But I think just there's such a divide where if I'm not, obviously if they're not paid for security and you haven't defined your requirements, it's not going to happen, and they're never going to even propose it. And that's where it's a catch-22 situation.
Any other questions? Nobody?
What are your thoughts on using Veracode as an independent third party, and then the offshore vendor and the customer, let's say the bank, share the cost and use this as a way of level setting where they are on a daily basis on the code delivery?
Well, I don't think I'm qualified to comment on Veracode's effectiveness, because I personally haven't used it myself. But if they claim to do what they do, or if they do what they claim to do, I think it seems like a viable option, especially for things like looking for anomalies like backdoors, things of that nature in code. But also, again, we're talking a lot about applications which aren't just off the shelf in this case, where you don't have access to source code. I think, given that you do have access to source code, and I know Veracode's pitch is it's even better even though you have access to source code, but I would beg to differ just a little bit. If I have access to source code, it'll be hard to convince me not to go through it to identify bad things.
Anybody else?
If you're buying a piece of software, you've had it developed, and it has a failure, do you not expect that company to fix it? And if so, then where do you differentiate the type of problem that the software has, and why the buyer of the software should have to incur additional costs for a piece of quality software?
Are we talking about commercial off-the-shelf software or custom developed?
Either way.
Well, I guess there's a slight difference in my mind, because if it's COTS, then it's different, because you kind of have to accept whatever the services agreements, or you have to accept whatever they have as accepted use agreements, and you just purchase it off the shelf and you go from there. But I think when it's custom developed applications where you're saying you are the owner of the source code. Going back to what I said, if it's a gray area, but you need to define at least the basic minimum level of security vulnerabilities to differentiate between, hey, this is a security vulnerability versus this is a software bug that got introduced in code unintentionally for just performance-related bug, but also translated into a security issue. There's a difference between those two to at least filter out the blatant security vulnerabilities, and I think that's where I would tell most clients to draw a line and say, at least let's get the application 90% secure. That 10%, you're probably never going to be able to say it's 100% secure.
Anybody else? I have a question.
Sure.
Ted Strain, Media Archives. Where do you see the future, like in 5, 10, 20 years from now? Do you think the black hats are going to win? Do you think, because I've heard people not so certain that in 10 years from now, not everybody's going to have worm. There's going to be no protection because they're staying ahead of the curve. The white hats are trying to catch up with them, but they're always trying to get in ahead of us. So what's your take on that? Well,
I'll answer that question based on my personal incident response experience. And did you just say, are black hats going to win? They are winning, unfortunately. They're definitely well ahead of the curve. Everyone gets a false sense of security. Oh, I have updated antivirus software running on my system. Well, yeah, it doesn't really matter. It was packed software that went right through that. People are investing millions of dollars worth of technology to protect their crown jewels, so as to say. Black hats are still breaking in. How are they doing that? I don't know. Targeted phishing attacks. Bypassing antivirus, have malware that's smarter than you think. In my opinion, unfortunately, from over the last 2 or 3 years at least, what I've noticed is I've seen organizations who dump a lot of money into security but still getting compromised because black hats are ahead of the curve, unfortunately. And it's a catch-up game for folks like us.
Thanks. Anybody else?
Yeah, I was just curious, do you feel like the development community offshore actually has the skill set to code secure applications and they just don't because of performance and cost constraints? I mean, as a consumer of offshore development, is it reasonable to expect that that's a capability that they have, and if I come back to them, after having looked at the first draft of the code or what have you and identified 10 issues, are they capable of solving those problems?
Right. So I guess in terms of the skills of the folks, and again, like I said, I know a lot in India, so I can kind of talk based on that experience of mine. What I see is obviously like any other business, their skill sets are tailored to what their clients want. And unfortunately, there hasn't been a big push on security from clients in the US or the UK or Australia, what have you. So there are very sharp, smart developers out there. And it's just that those skills haven't been developed because they haven't been viewed as a necessity. If the push comes from here, they'll be up to the mark shortly because it's a competitive world out there. There's so many of these offshore shops that they just want to battle each other. So if you say, hey, what I'm looking for is this basic minimum level of security, they're going to push for it. So I think the capability exists. It's just that it's not being tapped into, or they're not being made aware or educated enough.
Okay, anybody else? Got time for one more. Comment.
Since we do have an offshore shop, we are working with many large companies, and this is to answer the question here. Even the Owasp India chapter has been started. We had a similar event there, which was again promoted by companies who are in the services industry to get the same amount of influence there. And we are running COEs in many companies, not just us. There are many companies running security COEs, doing security code reviews, incorporating in the SDLC, and we're doing it for Fortune 5 companies. So it's not that it's not happening right now, but it does cost more because these developers, again, as there is a shortage here, there is a huge shortage there as well. So if you need to pay somebody 3 times the salary that a regular Java developer costs, you want to make sure that you're getting paid back for them. That's all there is to it. But there are enough people there right now who have this capability and provide full-blown. In fact, we are also currently using the ASAPI framework. We are heavily involved with identity access, single sign-on, role-based authorization capability, integrating that. So it's a skill you can find across many Indian companies, not just ours.
Okay, great. I guess that's about it. Thanks.
All right, thanks.
And once again, you can go to owasp.com.